I'm Director of the Olive Tree Programme, who are your hosts this evening here at City University for another Middle East Forum, where the objective is to expand and deepen our understanding of an issue. And I'm very excited on this occasion because we have lined up the best of the best to talk about lessons from British experience of war and diplomacy in the Middle East. And we will start with Sir Tom Phillips on my right, who was, amongst other feats in his career, ambassador to Israel and subsequent to that, ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And some of you may have seen a very interesting article that he wrote about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Prospect in the middle of last year. Then we will go to Frank Brenchley, who is on my left, and Ledwidge. Why did I say Brenchley? He's a spook, I'm terribly sorry. Frank Ledwidge, he didn't even correct me, who is spectacularly interesting in his book about losing small wars, and has a military career behind him, has served in most of the trouble spots in the Middle East, and is also a lawyer. And if that weren't feast enough, we will then go to James Rodgers, who is now on the faculty of the journalism department here at City University, but has worked in the Middle East as effectively a war and TV correspondent. So let's go, first of all, to Sir Tom. And there will be time for you to ask questions, but we're obviously going to have to just cover a few issues to begin with and then dig deeper later.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. War and diplomacy is clearly something of a vast subject, so I shall try and make a few reflections and try and draw some conclusions based on my experience in the Middle East, but more widely. And just as background, two conflicting points of view. First of all, of course, the well-known Karl von Clausewitz, the well-known 19th century Prussian military theorist. War is the extension of politics by other means, as though there were a natural, seamless continuity between the two. On the other hand, Tony Benn's assertion all war represents a failure of diplomacy. Two very conflicting points of view. So my basic question is which, if either, is right or can both be true, and what have we learned about the two from the last 20 years of intervention diplomacy, as it were. I'd first like to start, I'd like to give a couple of examples of things I've been involved in. First of all, former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I was the Joint Intelligence Committee representative in Washington in the mid-1990s, when the analytical community on both sides of the Atlantic was saying, this is a mug's game out there, all this sort of soft humanitarian diplomacy, UNPROFOR and all that is not getting anywhere. Unless somebody gets tough, there's going to be a problem. And as you know, the world went on being pretty awful with some pretty limp EU and other diplomacy. And it was only when Richard Holbrooke and the Americans started to make firm calls about who in the main was responsible, Milosevic, and showed a real willingness to take military action against the Serbs' airstrikes, that the way was paved to the Dayton Agreement. And I'd argued that had the West been much firmer, much sooner, a lot of the suffering could have been avoided. And I then went back to London to head up the Eastern, what became what was the Eastern Adriatic Department, through the Kosovo crisis, and we started that with the mantra, no second Bosnia. We will do all we can on the diplomatic front to reach a solution, but if in the end Milosevic does not accept what's on offer, we have to be ready to go all the way. And our ministers accepted that, and I think Tony Blair, George Robinson and Cook were very brave about that, and they did see it through. And although it would have been very, very nice had Milosevic accepted the diplomatic package that was on offer for autonomy for Kosovo before the war, he didn't, and they were prepared to go all the way, and we got the result we did. So in that case, I think war was a meaningful extension of diplomacy for all the shortcomings in what's happened since. On the other hand, I've seen some very successful conflict prevention diplomacy in my time. I think most startlingly when I was High Commissioner to Uganda, 2000 to 2002, when for a moment it looked as if there was going to be a war between Uganda and Rwanda based on some pretty complex factors, including personal rivalry between the two leaders. And Claire Short, with some very brilliant diplomacy, including flying out and meeting them both on the border and talking them out of it, I think made a major impact. You can ask, did that really stop the war? But I was there, and I think it had a very significant impact. And of course, that shows, I think, what individuals can do. It also shows what implicit leverage can do, large British aid programmes in both countries. Third example, Afghanistan. I was UK Special Rep 2002 to 2006, after the initial 9/11 conflict. But I think that the invasion of Taliban-ruled Afghanistan was again both an extension of diplomacy and a failure of diplomacy, in that clearly it followed on from the failure to get the Taliban to distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. It's also clear to me that at the stage, it seems clear to me, the stage when the decision to go in militarily was made, and I wasn't involved at that stage, I just wonder how many people are aware of the consequences of military action. Once you go in, what you do, it leads very quickly to a full nation-building agenda. Or else when you come out, what happens? The Taliban and AQ come back. So the question is, how quickly do you wake up to the consequences of the military action from the start? And I also note too that when I was doing that job, that was also when the decision was taken to go into Iraq, 2003, and certainly from an Afghan perspective, that was a very, very negative diversion of resources at a critical time. I also have a question mark about whether the West nowadays has the strategic patience and even the competence to stay the course in countries such as Afghanistan, but maybe we can come back to that. I wasn't involved in the Iraq War itself, but I think history has shown that there was a similar, largely American failure there to understand the full consequences of military action in terms of the kind of commitment the subsequent effort to help the Iraqis to rebuild their society would mean. And of course there the relationship with diplomacy is a fascinating and complex one, because that has to include the UN effort, the search for the weapons of mass destruction and everything like that. Iran is of course now a very interesting test case of its own. We're not yet at the end of the story of the effort to stop Iran developing a military nuclear capability, and sanctions do now seem to be having some real bite. President Obama seemed clear during the presidential campaign that containment was not an option, is not an option. Though I think it's fair to say, just as a commentator as it were, that I don't detect any enormous willingness in the West to contemplate the use of force at the moment. And there's certainly a sharp awareness of the downsides, the possible regional downsides of any Western or of course Israeli military action. But it's equally arguable, not least by the Israelis, that for diplomacy to be successful, the Iranians need to believe that the military option really is on the table, whatever the consequences of that action. The jury's out on this one yet. I suppose history will draw its own conclusions. Some concluding remarks. First of all, be wary of general lessons. Each conflict situation is unique and has to be assessed in its own right, with a close study of the lines of force involved and the scope for leverage, the extent to which personal relationships between leaders might be an asset. Secondly, in recent history terms, it seems to me possible that we've seen an example, we've seen a sort of a curve of the dangers of success. I mean, military successful, with all its limitations, military action in Kosovo and Sierra Leone maybe created a sort of sense of hubris about what was possible in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's interesting to me now, looking back to it, to compare, I can laugh at what the EU did in the Balkans, but in some ways EU soft diplomacy in Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War was perhaps very, very successful in bringing about a transition to democracy in those countries compared to harder line stuff in the Middle East, cultural differences between the two parts of the world, etc. I'm also conscious too, when I look back at my own career, that there's much deeper historical perspective in play. I mean, it's certainly arguable that before World War I, the idea that war was an extension of diplomacy was absolutely accepted and had a very wide currency. And in a way, the slaughterhouse of World War I perhaps has changed public acceptance of such an approach, at least in Western countries. And I think too, the rise of democracy in itself is a factor here, changing what's acceptable in terms of numbers of body bags, etc. I think also there's a need in the longer term to consider whether the nuclear age has changed the rules. I mean, you can argue that nuclear weapons may have made major conflicts between the great powers less likely because of the consequences of their use are unthinkable. But on the other hand, I think it's radically unsafe to conclude that nuclear weapons will never be used or will never be developed by or fall into the hands of people who won't use them. And I also think we're missing what we did miss at the end of the Cold War, a major chance to get serious about disarmament. I haven't mentioned one issue, maybe Frank will later, the issue of the question of whether there's a legal basis for military actions in any particular situation. But that is a massive issue when you're involved in Kosovo or any of the conflict zones that I've talked about. One key issue seems to me that international law is evolving. It's not a constant thing. It's not as easy and unslippery, or relatively unslippery, as domestic law. When I did my course on international law way back at the beginning of my FCO career, I remember an FCO lawyer joking when we asked him for a definition of international law. International law is what the other guy breaks. I think things have moved on since then, if I can put it that way. And of course, there's another extent. We talk about military action as an extension of diplomacy and the failure of diplomacy, but military action, diplomacy can sometimes pave the way for military action. One thinks, as one particularly negative example of that, the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, prefiguring the carve-up of Poland. I think too that diplomacy can sometimes fail because leaders actually want to go to war, and in that circumstance, there's not much you can do about it. I wasn't involved in the Russia-Georgia conflict in 2008, but everything I've read about it tends me to suspect that both sides were up for a fight. It would be very difficult for any diplomacy to stop that happening. Another factor for a professional diplomat is where is the Security Council? Splits and differences on the Security Council clearly do not help efforts to diffuse tensions when and if they mean that the players on the ground feel their back is being protected by their backer at the big table. But of course, a united Security Council doesn't necessarily mean war can be avoided. Think of the countdown resolutions to the first Gulf War, even if it certainly helps to resolve the legitimacy issue that's out there. Next, I think, is a huge part of a diplomat's task is always living with, coping with, tidying up the consequences of conflict. I mean, again, looking back at efforts there post-World War I, I think pretty disastrous efforts to create a better world. Margaret Magnuson's book in that shows how many of the conflicts had their roots in the suffering after that war. I think on the whole, people were more successful, at least for a limited time, after World War II. I certainly have found a huge amount of my time in the Middle East in recent years is in effect coping with the consequences of the Iraq conflict, not least in creating strategic space for Iran. Other general point, I think, is that once there has been a conflict, once there's been a war, conflicts on the whole become, or some conflicts become much more intractable, attitudes harden. One thinks of the Falklands. It was never going to be easy for there to be any possibility of a negotiated solution. I would say it's radically impossible to imagine it now in the wake of a war and the suffering that's happened. One general rule that I've taken very much to heart is never threaten force unless you're prepared to go all the way and actually use it, which means officials need to tell the truth to political leaders from the start if the latter want to maintain their credibility. We can go into examples of that maybe in question and answer time, but for me it's absolutely fundamental. And you have to know what you're trying to achieve. Never use force unless you're clear about what you're trying to achieve, while recognising that goals can change and can have to change in light of events and developments, which is another way of making a key point. Military force can never be a substitute for diplomacy or politics. There has to be a clear linkage to a political goal, and some problems are not susceptible to resolution by military force, even if they can be suppressed by such force. And I think too, another large part of my own experience has been that diplomats have to be very sensitive to the domestic political mood. In modern democracies in particular, you can only use, I think, military action if there is a clear domestic political consensus to do so. I mean, all of us think about the domestic political cost of the Iraq decisions in that context. And you can't depend on a consensus at any one time lasting. I mean, look at what's happened in Afghanistan. The consensus has, in fact, I think, started to go, or has already gone, on what we can do there. And so let's see, in a way, how the French get on in Mali. And finally, never ignore the exhaustion factor when you're thinking about conflict and diplomacy. And I think somebody should write a thesis about exhaustion being, at least in some cases, a key factor in successful conflict resolution. And maybe that's what's missing on the Israeli-Palestinian front. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will leave that menu of topics for further discussion sitting there and move straight to Frank Ledwidge.
First thing I'd like to say, if I might, is I'm not a professional soldier. Professional soldiers are sui generis beasts. They're a discrete profession, and you'll rarely hear, I think, well, you'd never hear anybody who's actually a serving soldier talk in these terms. Their comments are seriously circumscribed. by what they're permitted to say. So I'm a reservist, or was a reservist, and I retired several years ago, and I in no way speak on behalf of the military. However, I think it's fair to say that what I'm about to say represent the views of a great number of soldiers who served in the campaigns that Tom's outlined. I myself began my military service in Bosnia, went through Kosovo, did some time in Iraq, as well as a military officer, a citizen soldier, as it were, and then as a civilian in Afghanistan and later on in Libya last year. And I think it's important to address and to extend what Tom has, the insight Tom's given to us at the sort of strategic level down to the operational level, which is where most soldiers work. Senior officers work at that level, and they tend also to extend up to the higher strategic level. And it's the responsibility of British senior officers for the disasters of the last decade that I want to address in my brief comments tonight. Because to a very great degree our military command has got away with this, and they should not have been allowed to do so and should not be permitted to do so. Tom in his discussion touched on the law, and we can move on to that should the conversation take us there. I only put one gloss on what he said. At its highest, Blair's case rested, as everyone knows, this is a pure comment as a lawyer really, rather than as a soldier, on the Chapter 6 resolution in the 1990s, I recall, I can't remember the number of it. Lord Bingham points out that the purpose of that resolution was to restore peace and security. To restore peace and security. It was the case of Blair that we should invade a country to restore regional peace and security. I leave that there. It's a major maelstrom. But closely linked to international law, of course, are concepts of just war. Just war theory is very, very practical for soldiers at the junior end and soldiers at the end of a rifle, as I was for 7 years of my life. And it is also a key thread running through the decisions made by senior officers and politicians. And those of you who know about, or have heard, or studied, or looked at, or are spoken to about just war, will have heard the concept of the laws relating to going to war. There's basically six just war criteria for going to war. The two most crucial ones are that we should have an achievable aim. The aim or your objective should be achievable, and that your losses should be outweighed by any of those gains that you make. Let's just reflect on the losses sustained by our country, Britain, over the last decade or so. The two wars that we've got ourselves involved with, and I say got ourselves involved with, they were both wars of choice, have cost us financially about £50 billion. £50 billion. NASA reckons you can send a man to Mars for £60 billion. We've spent £50 billion on two catastrophic wars, both in terms of their result and longer-term political consequences, I contend. We've also lost 619 soldiers killed so far, 3,500 seriously wounded, men and women who won't be recovering anytime soon, who will bear their scars the rest of their lives, plus their families. And just as importantly, or more importantly, we've killed thousands of civilians. I estimate at the very least 1,000 people in Helmand by accident, and rather more, unfortunately, in the early days and subsequently in Iraq. We can discuss that in detail if people are interested. Our losses should be outweighed by our gains, a key just war ideal. So, within that, or against that background then, what about these senior officers and their responsibility? I spoke to a 4-star army officer. I can't name him, it was in private. Let's say he was closely involved with the Iraq campaign and Afghanistan, who told me that we in Britain, and particularly the senior reaches of the army, cannot do strategy, because strategy is done by other people, namely the United States or, as he put it, the coalition. I think in the last decade I've never heard such baloney. It's not traditional it moves away that idea from not only command responsibility, but from the deep traditions of our military culture. Let me give you an example. You will often hear the British Army, perhaps less often now than we used to, you will often hear the British Army and senior officers therein tell you about the successes of our counterinsurgency strategies in the 50s, 60s, and in Northern Ireland. And they rest their ideas often on a particular campaign in Malaya. We don't need to go into the details. The general in charge of the Malaya campaign, when he took over command, insisted, on the day before he signed the dotted line, as it were, to take over responsibility for hundreds of thousands of troops. Before I am deployed, I insist that I am given a clear steer from the highest authorities as to what I am intended to achieve at the political and the military level. Only by having given that guidance, can I proceed. I require an answer. He received one by return from the Colonial Secretary, indeed from the Prime Minister by way of the Colonial Secretary, outlining in terms what his objective was in the medium and long term. Given those objectives, he designed his military campaign. That's how you do strategy, I would suggest. Now, instead of thinking in those terms, instead of thinking about their strategic responsibilities, providing advice as to what can be done by British forces, that's their professional duty, senior British Army officers. What we've had instead are senior, by army perhaps I should clarify, I mean military officer, I'm myself a naval officer. So that absolutely should make that point. Senior military officers, excuse me, instead of pursuing their strategic and their professional duty of providing good advice to our political leaders, have pushed the interests of their services. Let me give you an example. The entry into Helmand in 2006, somewhat controversial at the time, was based partly, I think it's fair to say partly, or at least the extent of it, the numbers of troops, the scale of it, the way they were deployed, on the size of the British Army. And General Dannat, who was at the time commanding the British Army, stated to one of Sir Tom's colleagues, Sheriff Cooper Coles, that we've got these battalions coming free from Iraq. We must use them or we will lose them. That's the interests of the army driving the extent of the deployment, I would suggest. And that's, by the way, a pattern that runs through British military strategy and continues to run through the discourse, even now. How often do you hear complaints about the size of the military? How often do you hear senior officers on television or on the radio speaking about how emaciated we are in terms of our defence and what we might have to do? Ladies and gentlemen, before designing your armed forces, perhaps it should be incumbent on those advising on it to indicate what it is those armed forces exactly are for at the highest levels, both in designing the armed forces and also in designing a particular given campaign. For what are you there? What are your objectives? Are they 6 monthly objectives? Do you have a political objective into which you can feed? If not, ask for one. This was never done in either our Iraq or our Afghan campaign. And excuses to the effect that it's not the duty of a general to set strategy are, to my mind, entirely specious. But then again, which general? We have in our armed forces more senior officers than any other major serious military power. We have 450 generals in our armed forces. That is more, and by that I include admirals, commodores and brigadiers, as any other army would. We have about 6 times more per capita than the US Marine Corps, 5 times more than the US Army, and 10 times more than the Israeli armed forces. Now, I hold no brief for the Israeli armed forces, and I make no political comment in saying this, but one thing you have to give them is that they make their senior officers accountable for failure, and they know who it is. Let me give you an example about what I'm concerning this. I think it was in the most recent Lebanon war. It didn't go very well, did it, in southern Lebanon? The divisional commander, his immediate superior, and the Israeli military chief of staff were all fired for that failure. There weren't very high casualties in it by any military standards, but their political objectives, such as they were, had failed, and the army had failed in achieving such as objectives that could be identified. Yet, who in the British military hierarchy can we hold responsible for the disaster, as I think all, even military officers acknowledge it was, of Basra? Well, the Iraq inquiry was set up for that kind of thing, you might think. And who appeared there? No less than 37 generals appeared before the Iraq inquiry. Well, which one was responsible then? Or which 2 or 3? Those, by the way, were not all the generals who served. Many dozens more brigadiers served. None of them were allowed to give evidence. They were too low in rank. I'll close now, as I think I'm getting to my time limit for the moment, and stray on to another perhaps more tetchy political topic, the matter of responsibility of senior officers for the responsibility of senior officers to the extent they are responsible for our disasters. Primary responsibility must, of course, rest with politicians. And I'll touch on the special relationship. I would suggest that we have been so subsumed within the so-called special relationship that any objective assessment of where our national interests lie have been buried to a point where they are no longer recognisable or distinguishable from those of the United States. That's particularly the case, I would suggest, in Iraq, and continues to be the case in Afghanistan, a country of peripheral interest to the United Kingdom when compared, for example, to Pakistan. I think I'll leave it there for the moment and look forward to the rest of the discussion. I won't stray too much on James's territory of media. There's a great deal to be said there, and perhaps we can cover that in the military context of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for adding so many exciting topics to the ones we already had. Yes, James.
Thank you.
Can you you being a media man?
How does that sound? That sound
We've
going
got
out
to
for
record
everybody?
this to post on the website, you see.
In 2006, I was living in West London in a very, very small street. I'd just come back from 2 years of living and working in Gaza, and I was about to go off for another posting to Moscow. I had an elderly neighbour with whom I'd become very friendly. I'd recently had a daughter, and he'd been kind enough to give my baby a teddy bear. So before I was going to leave to Moscow, I invited him in for a cup of tea. And he said, "So you're off to Russia, have you worked anywhere else in the world?" And I said, "Yes, I've worked in the Middle East for a number of years." He said, "Oh, whereabouts?" And I said, "In the Gaza Strip." Gaza. He said, "Gaza? I was 19 years old and in charge of the railway station." So that it was an interesting insight, because this street had literally about 12 houses in it. It was very interesting to me to find this gentleman who lived a very ordinary life. He'd done his national service and returned and worked as a printer until his retirement in his 70s, yet he had this connection with the Middle East, which I had with him in common. As far as we're talking tonight about lessons from the Middle East, I'd like to offer some from a journalist point of view, and then some perhaps wider ones while taking on board Sir Tom's warning against setting too much store by general lessons. From a journalist point of view, you have a very rare perspective of both journalism and diplomacy. I came to Gaza having spent 2 years in Brussels, witnessing up close diplomatic conferences where people would express concern about civilian casualties in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on. And so it was very different, very interesting to go there and to see the other side of the coin, if you like, to be there. In the same way as I had the opportunity to do after reporting from Manhattan in September 2011 and finding myself in Iraq, 2001 rather, and then finding myself in Iraq just a couple of years later. But in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly where movement is and where there's sort of increasingly less mixing of the two sides in the conflict, you do get a very rare perspective. I could wake up in Gaza on a Friday morning and hear the call to prayer and the Friday sermons which were broadcast from the mosques there, then I was one of the few people in that very cramped territory who could easily leave, on most occasions at least. So by sundown the same day, by the late afternoon, I could be in West Jerusalem and hear the sounding of the horn which marked the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. And within that, I was able to talk to a bigger group of people than I think I would argue many people have access to. I talked to settlers. There were settlers then in the Gaza Strip who did not necessarily welcome interaction with any kind of foreigners, and not necessarily with foreign journalists at all. I spoke to the refugees and their descendants, obviously soldiers and members of the armed groups. So you do get this very wide perspective as a journalist, which is often, I think, denied on many occasions to diplomats and indeed to military personnel. Some more general observations about my time of working in the Middle East, and some of them I think you will find fairly obvious, but I think they need restating. The first of them is that people don't like living under occupation. I remember hearing a conversation between a soldier and an officer in Basra in 2004 on the first anniversary of the invasion. And there had been a small device had been detonated, explosive, had nearly hit a British patrol in the town. I remember this was southern Iraq. This is where the invasion was supposed to have been largely welcomed as liberators. And the soldier was saying, was that aimed at us? And the officer was saying, well, yes, don't worry too much about it. But it struck me that the soldier hadn't really got much idea of what people might think about it. It struck me too that probably policymakers didn't too, and I think in particular, in this case, of Tony Blair and George Bush. The media, as Frank hinted at, is increasingly important and was in my time, 20 years as a journalist. It was increasingly perceived as being more and more important in our conflict. And Tom mentioned the Russia-Georgia war, which I did cover, and I will stray from the region just a little here to illustrate what I mean, because I think that the lessons from that conflict can be more generally applied. Georgia, you will remember, was, and of course, like many of these things, the roots of this go back at least to the breakup of the Soviet Union. The exact events as they took place remain disputed to this day and will probably never be entirely agreed upon. But suffice to say that South Ossetia, which was a region outside the control of the Georgian government and had been for some 20 years or so, was supported by the Russians in their separatist aspirations. The Georgian government sent troops in there to try to take control of the territory again. The Russians responded and sent in troops and drove them out. Now, it seemed at the time, or the Georgians probably imagined at the time, that perhaps they were going to get something more than diplomatic support from the United States. Nothing like that materialised. So, within a couple of days, it became clear that the Georgians' main approach was going to be to fight a very intense media war. It was quite remarkable. I was then in Moscow. I had been in South Ossetia shortly before. Those of you may remember seeing at the time the president, Mr. Saakashvili, was almost constantly on television. It seemed incredible for somebody whose country was at war. Somebody who's worked in Russia, I worked in Russia for many years on and off, first going there in 1991. I was absolutely struck by the access which we as foreign journalists were suddenly granted. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. Struck I was too by the fact that both sides had public relations companies in Brussels working extremely hard for them. I perhaps don't need to add that none of the public relations executives in question, I went to interview a number of them afterwards, had ever been anywhere near the region. But there's one thing which really stuck in my mind, which was an official of the Georgian Interior Ministry saying to me, when I was asking him about this, Georgia's massive use of resources in the media war, he said, in this century and in a conflict where you have a huge power against a small state, I think that, in other words, the media war, is almost as important as the military battle. So I think this is something that is, again, I would say relevant to our conversation tonight because it is more widespread, and the Georgian administration, Mr. Saakashvili's administration, was very close to Israel, so we can imagine they might well have got some lessons there. The Taliban have had good success in using the media. I had a PhD student at a previous institution where I was working who was talking about, an Afghan who was talking about how very successful they were at spreading messages through mobile phones. We saw recently the IDF and the Al-Qassam brigades slugging out trading insults on Twitter. And prior to that, a couple of years before, we had both the IDF and Hamas ordering their rank and file not to use Facebook for fear that it might give information to the enemy. Now, so communication is tremendously important, but I would say this as a journalist. Presentation is very important, but you have to have a good message. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your media operation is. If what you're saying is invalid or is not going to stand up over the test of time, it's not going to work. No amount of public relations companies in the world will put that right. So we're talking, I'll conclude now with making a couple of other points about the lessons we may have learned. One practical point, and this is perhaps born of the fact that I spent some time last week trying to explain to my journalism undergraduates why it was useful for them to study a language. Languages are incredibly important, and I think that's something that we would need to do as much as we can. I'm not saying we should turn out legions of Arabic or Farsi speakers, but perhaps if we had more people who spoke French or German, they might more readily adapt themselves to learning other languages subsequently. Religion. I think we in the West, the secular West, perhaps forget its importance. And this afternoon, in making some final preparations for my remarks this evening, I was looking on the internet to see if I could find anything about General Allenby arriving in Jerusalem in 1917 and his decision to dismount from his horse. Amazingly, I found film of it, which I didn't know existed. It's on the Imperial War Museum website if anybody's interested. So returning to that and concluding to that, I'll go back to my small part of West London and mention that a couple of weeks ago I went into a church near my house, and I'm quite interested in the First World War, so I went over to look at the Book of Remembrance. Above the Book of Remembrance was a wooden cross, which I looked on closer inspection, had been carved from wood taken from the Mount of Olives. So it seems that the First World War lads from my part of West London had been both to Gaza and to Jerusalem. So it seems that perhaps some of the lessons which they acquired weren't terribly well learnt, and I hope now that our experience over the last 10 or so years can perhaps be more useful, made more useful in the future.
These guys didn't actually rehearse, but it's remarkable how well their portrayals have panned out the same picture. It's not something to be terribly proud of if you're British. I'm not quite sure how many Brits we've got here. Let's find out what the kind of spread of interest is in the audience. So let's have a few questions, see what issues they touch on. It would be very helpful if you could introduce yourself and say where you're coming from, if it's relevant. So, remarks, comments, yes please. One over here, and then we'll go to the back there, and then we'll come to the front here.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Laurent from France, and actually I'm at the Royal College of Defence Studies, so a keen interest in international...
A little bit further away.
Okay, is it going there? Or do you want me to shout?
No. Yeah, that's
okay.
good.
So I got a keen interest in international relations. And what I would be interested in is that for the three of you, please, well, nobody can stand to see or to witness suffering from other people. So whenever we get some information from the media about mayhem in other parts of the world, every individual gets very concerned. And there we get to this sort of humanitarian intervention theory. On the other hand, a government has to think of national interest and of what is actually possible to achieve with its military means or diplomatic means. So what is, from the experience of the last 10 years, what is the way ahead, not to get into some bad humanitarian intervention which drag on like, I would say, a proper occupation, and however, to address the problems we can see around the world.
Wonderful. Did you say earlier, when it was a little bit blurred, that you come from the humanitarian aid sector?
No, not at all. I'm from international relations with the Royal College of Defence Studies in London, and I'm French, as you can see.
But are you serving in the French military when you're not at the RCDS?
Absolutely, Navy.
Well, thank you.
And I've not been to Iraq or no, to Afghanistan. So I don't know anything about these two.
You're very welcome here tonight. Thank you very much. Now there's a gentleman at the back near the window. Yes.
Hi, how's that? I'm David Wareham. I'm a PhD student at SOAS, researching UK and GCC relations. I believe, Tom Phillips, you were ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the time of the Bahraini uprising, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And of course at that time...
Well, there have been if you look back in history, there have been trouble in Bahrain on previous occasions too.
Sure. Yeah, that's my question. So at that time, the Saudis helped the regime in Bahrain to crush peaceful pro-democracy movement. I have a question for you from Mariam Al-Khawaja, whose father is a political prisoner in Bahrain. She wants me to ask you, I'll quote exactly, ask him, are they going to continue silent diplomacy after 2 years of utter failure, or are they going to start promoting human rights?
Sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yeah, her question to you is, ask him, are they going to continue silent diplomacy after 2 years of utter failure, or will they actually start promoting human rights? They being
Who is they?
They being the British government.
And we're talking context Bahrain.
Yeah, exactly. Her father's a political prisoner in Bahrain. This is why she's asking the question.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, over here. No, actually, it's the man in the here, Roger. Way back.
Roger Hardy, I was a BBC journalist for many years. I'm a visiting fellow now at King's College London. So Tom, I wonder whether you agree with the judgment made at the end of Sherrod Cooper Cole's book, Cables from Kabul, about this whole issue of the balance between the politicians and the military. And he argues strongly in the Afghan context, but I think more widely too, that politicians, political decision makers are in some way afraid of challenging the military. The senior military think they don't really know enough to do it, or think that they won't be successful in doing it. And if I can be cheeky, Rosie, James Rodgers, a former colleague of mine, we worked together, but the politician's message is sometimes lousy, but gets through, and I'm thinking of Iran. Would you agree with me that in the run-up to the war in Iraq, there was a media failure, as well as a political failure? Although the BBC had terrible trouble with their government, my judgment in the end, I wonder what your judgment would be, is that we did not speak truth to power. We were not robust enough in challenging the case of the war.
Yeah, heads rolled when you questioned the dossier. Oh, at the beginning. Okay, well, I think Bahrain is specifically you, and then the anxiety about humanitarian suffering and media failure, and you were asked again to comment on something that Sherrod Cooper Cole said in his book, but I'm sure that Frank will have some perspectives on that. So let's go in the same order.
May I ask a slightly different question?
You will have a chance in a moment. If it's slightly different, if it's on one of these same topic, you'll have a chance in a moment. You'll have a chance in a moment.
Thank you very much, and all good questions. On the question of what do we do about witnessing suffering, it is very, very difficult. And certainly in my career, I've seen media coverage and the drumbeat of media coverage, as it were, driving out concern about massacres here and there, spur politicians to take bold decisions. It makes them think more about military options. And maybe over the last 20 years we've learned quite a lot about the limitations of that. I mean, certainly all the time I've been involved in that, people have tried very clearly to define what are the goals of military action. And in fact, the MOD people have always been very clear in the discussions in which I've been involved in. Tell us what you want us to do. We can't just go in and solve all this stuff. Now, I note that what's happening in Syria at the moment, where you can say, look at the coverage, and people aren't going in, and maybe that does reflect an even greater awareness, as it were, well, what would we achieve if we went in a very difficult situation? And people have learned, I think, once you go in, what then? I mean, what's the next step? I don't know what the right answer is to all of this. I mean, our legal basis for going in Kosovo was to, quote, to prevent the possibility of a massive humanitarian catastrophe, which at that stage was quite breaking new ground in international law, though in a way that potential legal base has been given greater strength by the 2005 summit of the UN on the responsibility to protect. So that there's been some sort of evolution of that in international legal terms. But that doesn't mean you can always achieve something, even when it might be humanitarian-wise desirable that you should. I remember we had this discussion with Robin Cook, and Robin Cook was asked about it to the press when,
he was Foreign Secretary.
He was Foreign Secretary at the time of Kosovo and Sierra Leone, and was being asked, well, you did those two, why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z? Why aren't you solving every humanitarian problem around the world? And he said to the press, because you can't always do the right thing doesn't mean you shouldn't when you can. Now, that's in a way a simplistic answer, but it's quite a good one, I think, in terms of you have to decide where you can make a difference in any particular situation.
Before you switch topics, can we go to Frank? Because I'm a bit concerned that we're only dwelling on whether you go in or not, but can we separate what you might have to do, having gone in, if your expedition was purely to get humanitarian assistance to a suffering population, as opposed to you were going to invade the country and remake it?
Just like to take issue possibly with all due respect to
No need for respect.
Concerning concerning the failure of the MOD to set or demand end states or objectives that need not always be an end state. Sir Kevin Tebbit, in his evidence to the Iraq inquiry, relates.
And he was permanent Under Secretary at the Ministry of Defence.
And certainly, there's no question he was aware. He himself was aware at the time of the initial deployment to Helmand that there was a serious problem of capability. That is to say, we were about to start fighting two major deployments on military standards at once. He asked the chiefs of staff, who relates to him, having asked the chief of staff, "Can we do this?" And the answer came back on the inquiry, "Yes, we can." Now that's revealing of another issue which I didn't touch on. It's almost assumed as the can-do attitude of the British military, that they will do what they are asked to do without complaint. This is at a platoon level, at my sort of level, company command, that's great. You're going to take a hill? Yeah, we can do that. But if it's invade, occupy a country and deliver long-term political effect, then a can-do attitude is an inappropriate attitude. But it may well not be a disagreement with you, so rather more of a gloss.
I want to come back and comment on that later.
Just to answer the naval officer's point, at least from my point, I myself was the same in military intelligence. I was outed a while ago by the Ministry of Defence, actually. Concerning, you mentioned this as well, James, knowledge of where you're about to go. Now, my colleagues in Northern Ireland were from the same background as their targets, as the people they were fighting. They were absolutely culturally identical. They supported the same football team, they often spoke the same accents, from inner city British towns. They were deeply involved, deeply aware of the kind of people they were fighting, and vice versa. They could fit in ideally. That was not the case in Basra, and even less the case in Helmand. Our knowledge of our background was almost zero, and an awareness, as James mentioned, that an occupier is always unwelcome, is entirely absent from any, until very recently actually, from any military discourse. We simply, British soldiers, don't see ourselves as occupiers. We're the good guys. We don't occupy other people's countries. And that level of awareness of how we are seen by the other side, now, it's present now, in fairness, in many soldiers, but it wasn't for much too long. And just one other thing on media, and then I'll close my piece. I think the media failure you spoke about, sir, in the second row, continues. We had a panorama on Monday night, Ben Anderson, BBC, excellent BBC documentary done by a freelancer. I think many British people would be wondering, having seen this display of the appalling, ramshackle nature of the so-called security forces we're leaving behind in Afghanistan, laid bare. Many people would be asking, hang on a minute, why did we hear about this before? Because we hear very little other from the media than heroic soldiers and we'll get there in the end. The fact is, we haven't got there in the end. We won't get there in the end, and we're leaving behind a total mess. And I think the BBC has almost completely failed in putting that across. Caveat that documentary on Monday night.
We're coming to James in a minute, but so Tom wants to come back, and I think what you're both saying is if the operation to go in to provide humanitarian assistance is going to be open-ended, is going to be military, and is in the end going to assume that you can remake the country, don't do it, even for humanitarian reasons. Is that right?
Say it again.
That if you're weighing up whether you can make things better in a humanitarian crisis, if the making things better involves invading, taking over, trying to mend the whole place, then better not to start. I think that's the message.
I'm not sure there are single lessons. I mean, look at Sierra Leone. Would anyone now say that was wrong? And I think you do have to look case by case, the nature of the government that's out there, the legal base, all sorts of issues. But certainly, absolutely critical is legal base, and absolutely critical is being clear that you can make a difference, and absolutely critical is having a political strategy linked to your military strategy in any particular circumstances. If I can just come back on Afghanistan and Helmand, which is one of the questions I was asked in relation to Sherrod's book, which I discussed with him over lunch the other day. He's a very old Foreign Office friend. I mean, I was involved in the Helmand decision, and I don't altogether agree with Sherrod notes with his description of it in the book. There was a meaningful effort to put together a military and political joint strategy on the back of the, it's called the Afghanistan Compact or something like that, the document agreed at the 2006 January London conference on Afghanistan, which was a sort of a template for where you go on Afghanistan. Now you can certainly argue, did we get those calculations right? And I think the point Frank made about whether at least some who were saying, what are we going to do with the army, taking it away from the wrong angle, that was, well, I will leave Frank's comments to stand on that. But the strategic issue that ministers addressed at that stage was, here we are in Afghanistan, and it's basically Afghan North, as it were, and down south, where most of the poppy is being grown, 80 to 90% of which is turning up with heroin on London streets coming from there, etc., etc. That wasn't the main reason, but if you don't do something about the south, you effectively have no exit strategy from Afghanistan, because the moment you come out, the south, Taliban stronghold will be back. So, I mean, as I saw the decision to do the southern Helmand deployment at the time, and I think ministers did look it in the face, is that there was a logic. We were still in the logic of supporting Afghan nation building on the back of the January 2006 Afghanistan Compact, and we had at some stage to take that down to the south. Now you can certainly argue that we got the calculations wrong, and I certainly now myself would draw the personal conclusion that, there's a question mark about whether the West has the competence anymore to do that sort of task. And certainly I think there is an issue about whether modern democracies have the strategic patience to do that sort of task anymore, particularly given media coverage. All those are questions. But we learn. I mean, history is being learned, we learn the lessons of history as we go along. But I don't think you can simply say that the Helmand decision was driven by the military. No. Shall I come back to Bahrain later?
Well, no, actually, the question about Bahrain was framed in terms of if you've tried quiet diplomacy behind the scenes, which is the British line on how best to influence the Bahraini government, and it hasn't worked over 2 years, isn't it time to wonder whether you're making any difference?
I mean, I didn't quite agree, as it were, with the way the question was phrased. I mean, first of all, there was that remark, Saudis helped them crush a course, from a legal international point of view, a legitimate government, the Bahraini government, which has treaty arrangements with GCC neighbours, asked those GCC neighbours to come in and help them, and they responded under a GCC flag, and certainly the GCC troops didn't take on a frontline duty. They were backstage, as it were, protecting infrastructure. Now, you can argue about all of that, and I know, and I've met Saudis and Bahrainis and many other people involved, and I know how complex that situation is. But of course, at that stage, when there were the concerns about what was happening on the human rights front, if you remember, the British government was pretty outspoken, and we got quite a lot of flack from Gulf countries, including Bahrain, for the line we took in criticising. Our policy, insofar as I was involved in it where I was sitting, I'm no longer an active civil servant, so I can't comment on the last 9 months or so. But you've got a very, very complex situation there, and there is an urgent need for a political process to try and resolve it. And our goal has always been to encourage that political process to get underway, to take place. So we were encouraged by the Commission Inquiry Report last year. You can argue about how fully some of the key recommendations of that have been carried through, and I'm sure we were encouraged by the reopening of dialogue that's happened recently, though of course there's been some worrying violence again since. I'm not in the picture on the current situation, but I myself do not see what is the alternative to a political process, and I'm sure British diplomacy is designed to encourage that political process. Thank you.
Right, James, you've been waiting patiently to defend the media.
I'm not going to defend the media over Iraq. I think I would agree with your analysis, Roger, of the run-up to the war. It's something I've thought about in great detail during that time, subsequently, and particularly since I left the BBC, when I've written quite a lot about it. I've tried to suggest some possible solutions which might not avoid repetition entirely, but might at least mitigate the circumstances. I mean, in journalism's defence, let us not forget the New York Times, one of the most respected news organisations in the English-speaking world, was at least big enough to publish a full-page apology in a way. And they committed errors for which some of my first-year journalism students, who I can see in the audience, not that they would ever do it, but for which they would be severely chastised were they to do so. Namely, they worked from a single source, and they went to confirm this with the sort of person who put them in touch with the source in the first place. It's shocking journalism. And the New York Times, I say, were big enough to admit to that. I think there's others who could possibly admit to the fault too.
But look, we're coming up to the Iraq 10th anniversary, and there's going to be a bit of kind of chest beating and agonising going on the media. The BBC are going to devote a whole day of coverage to what made the British make this decision to go to war. What is it exactly that you two BBC people, or ex-BBC people, are saying the media should have done differently back in 2003?
We should have challenged the case for war. The fact, of course...
He said we should have challenged the case for war.
Sorry. Rosie, you commented after my comment that the Director General of the BBC was in effect sacked. Technically he retired, it was a great time. It's true the BBC paid a high price for what it did in the whole Gilligan affair. And let me say for the record, Gilligan got it wrong. The BBC made a mistake. The Blair government tried to turn the particular mistake into an indictment, and this was Alistair Campbell, a former tabloid journalist, don't forget, who sought to take the particular case, the dodgy dossier, as Gilligan reported it, Dr. David Kelly and all that, which was a painful moment for all of us, and to try to turn that mistake, and I think it was a mistake, the BBC later admitted it, but far too late in the day, into a general indictment of the BBC coverage of Iraq. We were accused of being unpatriotic, and it's that I turn that around. I don't say we were too robust in criticising the case for war. We were not robust enough, and I included, when I said we, I meant we, the media in the United States and in Britain, not just the BBC. I really think that's the lesson.
Can you leave it there? Because this is going to get too much into detail, and I was looking for a more general comment about what you might have done over the course of a year.
Over the course of the year, when I returned to Gaza from a reporting assignment, I had a long conversation with my colleague who worked for the BBC Arabic service there. And he said to me, why don't we report this like we did here? We had a very successful network of sources there, because it was quite often we could not travel around Gaza. So we had residents of all the various parts of the territory, doctors, pharmacists, medical personnel, service personnel, and my colleague Fayed Abu Shamala said to me, why don't we try and do that in Iraq? Why didn't we try to do that? Now, of course, there would have been logistical difficulties with doing that in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, but it's not to say that something couldn't have been started like that sort of network, and that's indeed what I've suggested in my published writings about this subsequently, and I would argue that we haven't really come too much onto social media, but I would argue that this is one opportunity which social media does afford to journalists to try to do that. And I think in that way, as far as one could have done, what was some of the most memorable reporting from that period is probably Salam Pax, the Baghdad blogger who wrote about what it was like to live in the city before that. I mean, on the subject of social media, I would also argue that for every Salam Pax, there is a gay girl in Damascus who obviously turns out to be neither a gay girl nor in Damascus. So there are big caveats there, but I think there are real opportunities. And I think had Fayed had the chance to get his ideas to a high level with BBC management, he might have approached setting up something similar, which would not have taken away the bad reporting, but might at least have mitigated it.
Thank you very much. Now, this gentleman over here has been waiting patiently, and there's a woman further back, and another one just here. So let's start at the front. Apparently one of the mics is not working, so we'll just go with the working one.
Just looking at the whole thing, one.
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Well, I work in the city. Used to be a banker for 7 years in South Africa. Just looking at the whole thing, war and diplomacy and conflict and so on, slightly differently. The Iraq War started as a conflict against, with the Baathists and Saddam and all of that, and soon sort of turned into a sectarian conflict, or managing a sectarian conflict, where the Islamists obviously had poured in and they were quite active. And then, of course, we've got Afghanistan, or rather this whole AFPAC, whatever, and there's a line, dual line, which doesn't work quite as a boundary line, and people are going back and forth. And indeed, parts of Pakistan is where the sanctuaries are, the training grounds are. The thing is, new theatres are being opened up by this ideological enemy. Okay, if I can, use that general phrase, fired by apocalyptic, version of a religion. So you've got conflict now in Mali. Some of the Arab Spring countries have been turned into, there's a bit of confusion as to what's going on in Libya. You had the Benghazi incident. I'm just wondering what the panel feels. Are we in the midst of a long drawn-out conflict where there could be several theatres of conflict, but there's an ideological connection? And is it akin to what was true up until the 1980s? There was a Cold War that had to be fought over several decades. And indeed, in several ways, there could be military engagements and there were ideological cultural engagements.
Okay, good question. Thank you. Now, there's a woman slightly behind you. Yes.
Thank you. My question kind of follows on a bit from that. My name is Zoe, I'm also a PhD student in British policy in the Middle East and a journalist. And I'm wondering if you can comment, I guess, Frank and James as well, on Britain's more recent intervention in Libya, and obviously the coalition government's been very keen rhetorically to distance itself from Iraq and from Blair-style policy making, but I'm wondering if you can actually note any tangible differences in terms of policy making, ideology or interests from actually those that informed the Iraq campaign. And James, if you can comment, do you think whether there will be improvements in the coverage of the sort of Libyan, scrutiny of the Libyan campaign?
Whoa. Okay, and the woman somewhat behind you who's got her hand up.
I'm a physiotherapist and an artist. I'm Iranian. Growing up during Iran-Iraq war, I'm more inspired by peace. Yet this evening I heard a lot about war. Nevertheless, something came to my mind, which I thought it is helpful to share, which was in around 2000, when Afghanistan was basically captured by coalition, we were just in the office and we all thought, okay, the next step is Iraq, and then the next step is Iran. Now, I just want to say that is how we look at it. And when I immigrated to the UK, when I talked about my thoughts to my landlady, an English lady, she thought I'm a paranoid lady from Middle East, which obviously we are in a relationship, so this is not the case, and now she thinks I'm a fortune teller. So because everything apparently is coming true. The case is, the way we looked at it at the time was oil is playing a major part. Now my question from the panel is, from Sir Philip and Tom and James, what do you think? Does the idea of oil play any part in creating these laws? And what do you think or not? I just want to get...
Yeah, we've talked a lot about ideals. We've had a question about whether we've got an ideological war, a kind of Cold War going on, and now you're bringing us back to, is it all about oil? Right, well, you've got plenty to get through.
Thank you very much. I will leave Libya to my colleagues since I had left, or when I hadn't left before I haven't started, but I haven't been there. I don't feel too well qualified to comment on it. On the question of the Arab Spring, Islamism, and everything we're facing, I think these are very deep and difficult questions, and I was at a fascinating Chatham House conference the other day with a group of French and other academics looking at what's happening in a lot of Arab Spring countries. I mean, something very deep and long-term is going on, and like the French and Russian revolutions, let's come back in 100 years and ask ourselves, is it still too soon to say what it all means? And that great remark was at Chu Enlai to Kissinger, although apparently Chu Enlai thought he might be being asked about Tiananmen Square rather than about the French Revolution. That's another issue. I think that at the beginning of the Arab Spring, it was very, very interesting that it wasn't Islamists out there. This was protest for other reasons, and you didn't get American flags, and even Israeli flags being burnt out there. But it's obviously true that as time has developed, the Islamic political groupings were better organized and have been able to take advantage of the political space created. Similarly, the Arab Spring both signalled, in some ways, I think, the failure of Al-Qaeda. It wasn't an Al-Qaeda revolution, they had nothing to do with it. But it's also created additional operating space for them. I mean, history is not simple, as it were, so there is a problem like that. I mean, you can comment on all of that in detail, I won't, because we'll go on all evening. But what I would say is that my own personal view is that we're seeing the beginnings of a different and more meaningful sort of political debate in a lot of Arab countries. And we're seeing Islamic movements being dragged into a real political arena and being judged on it. You can make some interesting parallels between how gradually, I would say, Hezbollah and Hamas are evolving and changing in Lebanon and Gaza as they're sucked into real political responsibility. And if one's worried about Islamic groupings, I would say, well, it's no bad thing that they have power and they're seen to be normal mortals like the rest of us who fail from time to time and get things wrong in terms of a long-term evolution. And I think we're also seeing a very interesting fragmentation of the Islamic political space, if I can put it that way, a different sort of accountability and a gradual dependence on the ballot box rather than the Quran, or legitimacy, to put it in very simple terms. So I personally remain long-term optimistic about the way this evolution could go, but the risks are very high. It will be bumpy, it will be long-term, undoubtedly. The lady who asked about, you got quite right, how sad that we're talking about war. One of the bits in my remarks that I cut out because of being worried about being hit by Rosemary for going on too long was a sad reflection. People like, why does conflict happen? Because people like conflict. I think there's something in human nature to do with the way identity works, which is necessarily conflictual. And I think the role of a diplomat is to limit the damage, but the damage is going to happen. There's no perfect world out there in which there's no conflict. And at some deep and dark level, people like conflict. They want it, and the press make it. Everybody gets worked up about it. It's exciting, adrenaline flows, and it's a drug, conflict, and it both politically, but for normal human beings. And I think we have to remember that. And so the role of a diplomat is damage limitation, and you can't always limit the damage. It's going to happen. And I have a very dark view of human nature and of conflict in my heart. And
So Tom, whilst accepting absolutely what you're saying, might we not say that along with the people who get kind of addicted to the violence, be they soldiers or politicians, there are those who are savaged by it?
absolutely.
It's surely we hear from the First World War onwards that those who've got close up to war or been consumed in it experience the suffering more than ever.
No, I agree entirely, and I'm not saying it's hopeless. And I do think one can learn to manage conflict. I also think some of it's conflict to good, and conflict of ideas, conflict of this. Conflict is a way to generate change. And I do think that in societies you can see a ritualisation of conflict, even to sport and things like that. So I'm not saying it's always going to be Passchendaele and so on, but I think we have to be sophisticated in our approach to conflict and why it happens and what it is in human nature generates it. Oil. In my experience in the Middle East, there was never, I was never conscious of, never involved in a magic moment when we all sat down with the oil companies and said, we're going to fix the oil price, we're going to this, we're going to invade Iraq. Because I don't know if there was huddles in Washington with Bush and people from Texas and all of that, but I was never conscious of it, including all the time I was in Washington and in the region. Having said that, the Gulf and that area is clearly of major global strategic importance because of its impact on the global economy. And you get all these conflicts and everybody's looking at the oil price going up and down, are they going to close the Straits of Hormuz, X, Y, and Z. So it is certainly true that one, and only one, I can think of many others of the reasons why the Middle East matters is because the world economy depends on that. And it is a factor, and in my opinion, that creates a responsibility not only for the West, but for users. It also creates a responsibility for suppliers. It's a two-way contract, management contract. We all have, it's a good thing if we can work together to create as stable and normal market as possible.
So, two comments. It may well be that Sir Tom, certainly is the case, Sir Tom doesn't believe that oil plays a central part, has an effective role. But I recall a statement, I think it was by General Colin Powell, as he then was, that had Kuwait had as its stable crop carrots, we may not have gone to war over it. Whether that's the case with Iraq later on, from what I know, it seems to be the case that oil didn't.
Well, it was going to pay for itself. That
Well, yeah, but it seems it was a far more ideological, pragmatic or economic, realistic approach. There are realists amongst us, probably even here, who might well believe that oil is a perfectly reasonable reason to go to war. But certainly, as a former soldier, you mentioned peace there. Soldiers, well, it has to be said, soldiers like going to war. I did. I wanted to get stuck in. That's what we were trained for. If I wanted to prove myself, as all young men do, as we all do. That's what young men want to do. It's what soldiers train for. It's what soldiers enjoy doing well, particularly British soldiers. They do it extremely well. There's no criticism in that. It's just the way it is. As Peter Hitchens said the other night, the great criticism, young men are unwise. So older men to put some restraint on that. With respect to national policy, though, as opposed to personal comments about the nature of soldiers, I think we have a rather deterministic approach in the UK to conflict. We've got rather larger armed forces than we need. And I think there's a very real impulse amongst us to use that. Use them or lose them. Even at the highest levels. Speaking personally, I rather enjoy the Swedish approach, extremely capable military nations, same as Finland and the other Scandinavians, with the exception of Denmark, who do like to get involved. But they tend not to get involved unless there's a direct threat to them. That's been the case certainly in Sweden since the mid-18th century. It's a tradition. We, of course, have a different tradition that may need to be changed over the next decades. Concerning ideological fractures and fronts, one has perhaps got controversially to recall the words of Osama bin Laden. Your president, speaking of Bush, tells us that we hate you because of your democracy, we hate you because of your freedoms. Were that the case, said bin Laden, why do we not attack Stockholm? We hate you because you invade us, you occupy our countries, you take us on, so we will take you on in our countries. no greater gift could have been offered to Al Qaeda than the invasion of Iraq, except, of course, the invasion of Afghanistan, which was bin Laden's declared objective. He's made that statement several times to various reputable journalists, Arab journalists. He played right into Al Qaeda's hands. Fronts can only be fought overseas if we elect to fight them. Mali being a perfect example. Now, Mali may well have strategic coherence with the UK, in that it might well preserve the French, or rather extend the French alliance, and that's perfectly reasonable, provided we are clear to ourselves, if not to anyone else, that that is why we are doing it. Mali has absolutely no relevance whatsoever, presents no threat to us. No Malian, Algerian or Libyan terrorists are likely to appear on British streets, or for that matter, from what I've heard from French sources, Parisian ones. It may well be that France has its reasons. We have an alliance with France and we should support France. And that's a legitimate strategic objective. However, we should not be taking on Malian Islamists. I can think of nothing very little more pointless than that. I think that's pretty much... Oh yes, Libya. I think Libya... I can't really speak too much to the politics of Libya, save this. I remember speaking to a UN officer actually for Northern Africa, marvellous fellow, was Andorra. He's an amazing character. He'd just done a tour of the southern crescent of countries in North Africa and Maghreb, all the countries to the south and west of Libya. We, of course, being British, were, I think, understandably quite pleased with the way the Libyan revolution happened. Politics of it we can discuss what people want. But what he said, though, was rather more disturbing. He said, for those countries, every one of them he visited, the Libyan war was a disaster. He used that term. Nothing less than a disaster. Again, we come back to perspectives. Our perspective is very different from the Chad, Niger, Mali, Algeria, and countries further west. We see now perhaps the effect of the Libyan revolution, second-order effects on Mali more recently.
Do correspondents? Yeah, but also do correspondents get a war fever?
That's a good question, actually. I think for my generation of journalists who started working in the early 1990s, I think there's very few of us who would ever describe ourselves as war correspondents. If we were going to cover international affairs and diplomacy over the last 20 years in the post-Cold War, post-September 11th world, you had to cover conflict if you wanted to have a full picture. I think there are some people who enjoy it more than others, but there are some people who enjoy reporting the financial markets more than others. So I would like to make a point on the coverage of Libya, though, because I think what happened there was quite interesting. I wouldn't say it was necessarily improvement. I mean, it's difficult to compare the two conflicts because obviously it didn't go on nearly as long as Iraq, and with the exception of some hapless special forces who were caught in a farmhouse in the middle of the night, I don't think we had any troops on the ground. But I think there was at least one example of a very odd story possibly made up by the MOD, which was swallowed fairly whole, which was a story of air raids having not gone ahead because of fear of civilian casualties. Now that, to me as a journalist, doesn't really seem like much of a story. The story is, man bites dog, which is, the RAF goes ahead and has the air raids anyway, because even if they don't care about the civilian casualties. That what I thought was something would happen anyway. But that seemed to have been, impossible to verify, but it seems to have been taken largely at face value. But I think interesting in terms of journalism history in a way, the coverage was that we were sort of entered the post-embedded era, and I wasn't there, but looking at it, it reminded me rather of covering the first Chechen war in the mid-1990s. It reminded me of stories that colleagues who'd worked in Yugoslavia had told me. The main restriction on your movement, which was very different, with a couple of exceptions in Iraq, was how safe you felt to go anywhere. And it seemed that you could travel fairly freely, which is not what people reporting on conflicts in Afghanistan or Iraq have necessarily been used to in the last 10 years or so. So I think in journalistic terms, it may be that embedding is going to be something I've no doubt that will be returned to, but now there are new, different ways of covering conflict emerging once again.
I don't want our panellists to go away. Oh yes, there's one question at the back, and then what I'm going to suggest is that the three panellists say anything that they otherwise would go away wishing they'd said. Plus, I think there's quite a lot of people who are not British here, who obviously have, for various reasons, an interest in Britain. I wonder if the three panellists could say, in terms of the wisdom they've offered us about their respective professions, do any of you three think you are sufficiently heard, or your perspectives are sufficiently entertained in your professional establishments? I mean, is Britain about to have a wake-up and reconsider on all three fronts, or are you voices in the wilderness, or something in between? Right, yes please.
Hi, I was a student at SAS, and I'm an art student. So Tom was talking how Gareth Spring has been somewhat hijacked by certain business groups. I was wondering, as we're talking about lessons learned, 30 years ago, the Iranian Revolution, some people would argue that, again, that was hijacked. Did you feel that anything could be learned from the way that Western interference after and before that revolution, or have any lessons been learned from that?
Right, that's lessons from revolution, including the Iranian one. Okay, let's go the other way around.
Lessons from revolution. It's always takes a very long time. I think people, particularly nowadays, expect instant results. I mean, the one revolution, if that's the right word, which I saw at close hand, was the end of the Soviet Union. And I was quite struck by the way in which some of the hopes and fears I heard voiced then seemed to re-emerge in Egypt a few years ago. I met some activists, for example, at a conference here in London in 2011. People in their mid-20s who are this Facebook generation that we read so much about then, and about whom we hear so much less now. And it seemed to me that they didn't, in the same way that we in the West and we Western journalists didn't necessarily understand fully what was happening in Russia in the early 1990s, I don't think that the activists there really understood what was happening either. And their sort of expressions that everything was going to be all right, and everything's going to change very quickly, obviously have already not come to pass. So I think the lessons from revolutions is that you need to wait a while, but you need to try as far as possible to understand what's going on. But most importantly, as a reporter, and I would think probably as a diplomat too, you have to understand what the people involved really think. A couple of years ago, I was at an event at Chatham House where the ambassadors from the United States and the United Kingdom in 1991 in Moscow were both present. Obviously, 20 years later, it was fascinating for me to hear them speak very frankly. What they had failed to understand was the humiliation felt by people in the recently ex-Soviet Union with the collapse from superpower status to a country begging for international handouts. But I thought, somebody who's been Russia in the 1990s, I could very clearly see 91, 1992, 93, I saw Vladimir Putin coming. I didn't even know his name, but I saw a president like that re-emerging unless things went differently. By 98, 99, that was 100% certain. And I don't think we in the West ever understood that. And I saw some of the same ideas being put about before the invasion of Iraq, that suddenly democracy and free markets were going to flourish and solve every problem. But I don't think you can point to one example in recent years.
Okay, and are we learning here in Britain as far as your profession is concerned?
Are we learning? Yes, I think we are. I think my profession is even more cynical than it is legendary.
All right then. Are we learning?
Yes, I think many of the views I've expressed tonight are held by, if not a majority, then a very large proportion of officers at my sort of rank and level, brigadiers, colonels in the British Army and the other military services. We're not short of very, very bright people in the military. And they have good, strong critical faculty. There's a very strong internal discourse that sometimes doesn't get out. Certainly the response I have to these views that I've expressed in various other fora filled with military officers tended to be more cooperative than hostile. As I say, we've got some very, very good critical minds in the British military, and they're very aware of what it is. Concerning just one final point, which I have made, if I haven't made it, I was talking to a group of army officers about a year ago in these terms. The question came up of what should we be doing, what should we be aiming to do, what should be our role in all these big questions that military officers want to ask each other. And I gave some pontificating answer with very little basis of considered thought, as usual. Then an arms company executive spoke up. He wasn't a soldier, he'd been a junior officer at some point. He said this, listen guys, let's just get we in Britain have one brigade, that's about 5,000 people, who can be deployed at any moment. We've got about 7 ships that are available to do anything. Got an aircraft carrier, a couple of aircraft carriers coming up without any aircraft. The Indian Navy has, or will have by 2020, 4 aircraft carriers, extremely well, 70 major naval units, 20 nuclear submarines, and a great many well-trained army divisions. Get real, guys. There's very, very little we can do in that context. And he says, I haven't even begun with China. We need to start thinking realistically about our place. What we can do politically is probably greater than what we can do militarily. But at my world, the military world, we really have to start thinking about getting real. There's very, very little we can do. That's it.
Thank you. Now, I'm coming to Sir Tom in a moment, but I'm going to be sneaky and sneak in an invitation for a month from now, because I know as soon as we thank the speakers, you'll need to get out the door. A month from now.
To run away.
A month from now, we've got a rather unusual forum. It's still on the same theme of conflict in the Middle East, and it's entitled Talking to the Enemy. And what we're doing is bringing over back to London 6 of the graduates of the Auditory Scholarship Programme, 3 Israelis and 3 Palestinians, who graduated nearly 2 years ago and went back to work on their respective battlefronts, some under occupation or blockade, and some attempting to work in the human rights sector to see if they can make a difference. And they have some sobering tales to tell from the battlefront, which I think are well worth your while hearing, because you don't often get the opportunity to hear directly from young people who are trying to see what they can do to make a difference. And I can't guarantee you exactly what they will say. They may be more cynical, they may be surprised and have some surprising things to say about what works and what doesn't work. But I'm inviting you to return on the 27th of March to hear that. But I would like now to give the last thoughts on what should be said on this vexed topic to Sir Tom Phillips.
Thank you very much. One of the questions you asked was, do we feel our perspectives are sufficiently heard? Of course, I'm retired. What I'd say about the time that I was a diplomat, there was never a case when I felt I wasn't able to say what I thought to ministers. In honesty, I can say that. I can also say that there have been times when it's been difficult to get ministerial attention because they're busy with so much else, and I suppose when I was dealing with Afghanistan, so I was going on, that would be one of those moments, perhaps. Now, with the benefit of a bit more standing back, I think there is an issue in the UK system about whether we have enough challenge, whether we work too hard towards consensus. In a way, before we put the choices to ministers, in some ways, the whole way our Cabinet Office, Joint Intelligence Committee, etc. structures work, I think we need to do more to build in meaningful policy challenge. That would be a lesson that I personally have drawn from thinking about my own experience. Other lessons learned that we were asked about, particularly in relation to Iran and the revolution there, and I flew back from Israel yesterday watching Argo on the screen, which made me think about some of the first lesson that I take is think whenever we've got a business where there's some people we don't talk to, we actually have a problem. We should be prepared to talk to everyone, full stop, in any situation. Two, you can't impose solutions, ever. You have to work, if you want to get involved, you have to work with the grain of societies, with international partners, whatever. You've got to be realistic about what you can do, which you certainly can't impose, and certainly not with the sort of capabilities we've got in place. You've got to suppress now, even if you wanted to, as it were. What did we have at the end of Palestine? 100,000 troops on the ground. We still think we could suppress it. We couldn't change because we didn't have the political strategy to do it. Understand this, really, really, really understand the society in which you're going to have an impact. I mean, I would have a question mark in my mind about whether we really, really, really had absorbed everything we knew about Afghanistan and what we were trying to achieve there. And in Iran's case, I would say, Iran is basically a very revolutionary society. Twice in the 20th century, it had grassroots movements overthrowing people. It's very, very different from some of the countries in the Gulf. And I've been in Tehran, it feels differently. You have to understand the grain of that. And the lesson to British public and British ministers is understand the way we're seen in particular countries, and therefore what our involvement is going to mean. I mean, of course, how many people in the UK know about the British and American role in the 1950s in overturning an Iranian popular leader? But you can talk to Iranian about it, they sure as hell know. And do we really understand how we're perceived before we think about what we're going to do? And I find it distressing in my own society that we really don't have historical perspective on some of these things. And you're talking about bits of the world where they do remember the past. It's really today, and it's part of how they think. And that brings me on in a way to very last point. Somebody asked about what again, what haven't we said tonight? I mean, I've been struck tonight we haven't really got on to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I do think is a very central one, really, despite everything else is happening, and it's gone on far too long. I am very gloomy about it, but I certainly hope progress would be made. But there, I think, is an example. I mean, when I talk about it, I tend to bore people about it, dinner parties around the place. I'm just amazed. I mean, a lot of people talk about their question, what the hell's that? I mean, not even a sense that there was some British involvement and responsibility in this thing. And what does that mean? And we don't live our past enough. We don't try to make a moral continuity out of history in the way that some of the people we're dealing with do. And I think that short-term perspective in Western democratic politics is part of the problem.
Wonderful note to end on. Thank you all very much indeed.